Now, American Werewolf in London.
Heard of it?
Yes.
See, American Werewolf in London is not a comedy. It's called a comedy. They keep calling it a comedy. It's very funny, I hope. It is not a comedy.
Rick Baker's name may not be very widely known, but his werewolves certainly are.
Looking back on American Werewolf in London, first thing that comes to mind, like, I can't believe I was a part of making that. Like, I can't believe I was there. No, not me, you.
You weren't there. I could believe it. What do you mean that I would?
Yeah.
That's hard. No, I believe it. I wrote it, I produced it, I directed it. I was there.
What? It's time to talk about what many consider to be the best werewolf film ever made. Yeah, I've never really talked about werewolves on my channel. I never really thought that it was the subgenre for me, but recently something clicked. I don't know if it's the current revival of the Universal classic monsters. We're truly entering a beautiful era, but I've recently re-examined these movies that I once thought were okay, and now I'm obsessed with them. The other day, my coven members and I were watching Ginger Snaps, and I was often edible personally, and it was a transcendent experience. So I knew what had to be done. We're entering somewhat of a mini era on my channel, and for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about werewolf movies. Starting today with a deep dive of An American Werewolf in London. We'll start with the inspirations and development of the original script, casting, other general pre-production stuff. Then we'll get into the production itself, shooting in England, stunts, other fun stories. And of course, we will have an entire segment dedicated to the special effects. We will break down Rick Baker a bit. We'll talk about the evolution of Jack and of course the transformation scene. We'll get into the themes of puberty and Jewish fears. Finally, we'll talk about the reception of the film and its lasting cultural impact. I've pulled out lots of archival interview clips and BTS footage, so you don't have to take it all from me. But if you've been a little bit confused for the last minute or so about what I meant when I said I was watching Ginger Snaps with my coven, yes, you have indeed stumbled upon the Antichrist's YouTube channel. Very pleased to meet you. I mark the end of times, the apocalypse, etc., but before that comes, I would like to talk about horror movies with you all. And we can do that more often together if you click subscribe, the like button, and the notification bell. That way you never miss our next meeting. Today's meeting might get a little bit hairy, so buckle up while we dive in. Oh wait, oh my god, I forgot to light the candle! Can't believe I did the intro without my little ambiance. Anyway, let us now talk about inspiration and development. The most obvious inspiration for An American Werewolf in London is all of the Lon Chaney Jr. Wolfman movies. Writer and director John Landis was born in 1951 and grew up watching those films on TV, but what set the Wolfman apart from other classic monsters was that he was just a regular man. Dracula is an ancient count, Frankenstein's monster is a collection of dead body parts reanimated, and I think because of that, people felt really inspired to tell personal stories using the werewolf as a plot vehicle. That's just what John Landis did, but he had a different idea for the wolf.
In most of the Wolfman movies that have gone before, the beast himself, the werewolf, is almost always a two-legged creature. As in Werewolf of London, when Henry Hull just walks and goes behind these pillars, and he sort of, as he comes out, looks more and more like the lead in Grease, you know, as he comes out. I couldn't do that because I just didn't feel like an audience would buy it now. Also, in the Wolfman, in all the Wolfman movies that Lon Chaney made, which were wonderful, I was uncomfortable with the lap dissolves, you know, having Chaney sort of getting hairier and hairier, because I wanted to show this young man who's standing there becomes this four-legged beast, and I wanted to show it on camera.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because first he had to write the script. Though I think a collection of moments from John's life can be attributed to him eventually having the idea, starting with growing up on the Wolfman. He also first visited London at the age of 18 in 1969, when he was on his way to Yugoslavia to work as a production assistant on a movie called Kelly's Heroes, and this one starred Clint Eastwood. Now, I'm not gonna pull the original quote from Landis on this because he uses some kind of offensive, like outdated language, but the story goes that he was riding along with a Yugoslavian crew member along this one-lane highway that went for like 400 miles when they stumbled upon a group of Romani people performing a ritual on their dead.
It was a crossroads, and they were burying this man. It was a dead guy, wrapped with a canvas, and the canvas was wrapped with garlands of garlic, and they're burying this guy feet first. He's being buried this way so he doesn't get up and cause mischief. And so I'm going, well, hello? What, you mean get up? Like a zombie? Get up? What? I kept thinking, what if he did get out?
And that seems to be the seed of inspiration for Jack and what his character would go through, which is surprising to me because I would have thought that inspiration came from The Night of the Living Dead, which was released just a year prior. But anyway, that very year in Yugoslavia, he wrote the original draft of the script at age 19, very much inspired by the sights and sounds around him. But you might be thinking, 1969, 2 + 2 is 4. They waited a really long time to actually make the movie. Yes, there were some struggles at getting this movie made, most of which funding, because studios just were not really understanding the script.
I wrote it in 69. It actually got me a lot of jobs, that script, because it was very, very funny. But the unanimous response was either this is too funny to be scary or this is too scary to be funny. It was just inconceivable to people that you could be both.
That would not be the last time he would hear that about his film, but nonetheless, he trucked forward. Rather than getting the money for the movie up front, he went through a process that's called negative pickup. It's not something that's really done in the industry anymore, unfortunately, but I think that it's just evolved a bit. Back then, John Landis had to go to a British bank and pull out a $10 million loan. So he, as a filmmaker, took all of the monetary risk, but with that risk came a lot of freedom from studio involvement.
What was wonderful is I didn't have to fight with anybody. I didn't have to ask for permission. It would be like, John, could I please have a Chapman crane for the sequence on Thursday? Yes, John, you can. Because
Right.
It was just me. That was a pleasure. That was the easiest movie I ever made.
Once the film was complete, the studio would then decide whether or not they would want to pay him the $10 million for it to then distribute. Then Landis would pay back the bank with interest on top of that. These days, studios will pay for the rights to distribute a film, but it doesn't really seem like the filmmakers get paid back. The best recent example that I could think of is A24 acquiring the rights to Talk to Me after that film was made independently by the guys from Raka Raka. This didn't mean that they didn't still have trouble getting production rolling in London, though. Another body they had to deal with was the British Equity, which to my understanding is basically just the English version of SAG-AFTRA. It's like the British Acting Union, who would only cover 4 work visas for the crew. So things almost fell apart when they realized that they might not be able to cover their actors. I'm pretty sure that they were operating outside of the rules a bit. I think you'll agree with me on that once you hear more stories about production. So why don't we get into that now, starting with casting.
It wasn't a big screen test. I've done tests and things for projects I didn't get. I mean, we can have that list, and those were always, pretty involved. This was not. This was just an arrangement through an agent calling John Landis.
Casting was actually a pretty simple process for this film. Landis did not go the traditional audition route. Landis knew David Naughton already, as did a lot of people, for his Dr. Pepper commercials. I don't know if you noticed, but he still drinks it. It was sitting on the table next to him at that panel. But his Dr. Pepper ads were huge, and after watching a few of them, I can see why.
I drink Dr. Pepper, don't you know? And the taste is making peppers everywhere I go.
The singing is adorable. Naughton also had a bit of a singing career, but that's a story for another day. Wild that we basically have Dr. Pepper to thank for An American Werewolf in London happening. Because as is often true, the movie would not be the same without our amazing lead actor. Griffin Dunne didn't audition either, and not only that, but this was his first feature film. I met with John in an audition room with many other actors, and we talked for about 10 minutes, Dunne recalls. Nothing particularly leapt out at me about the conversation. I thought because I didn't read or audition, he didn't want me, and I was kind of relieved. I've always been terrible at auditioning. I've got dyslexia and it's difficult to read off the page cold, so I was completely surprised when he called me. He said he was sending a guy with a script to my apartment, and if I was interested in doing it, I had to read the script while the guy stood in my hallway, then hand back the script. I like all that cloak and dagger stuff, and I found the script hilarious. The only thing he asked me when we met, and he asked several times, was if I was claustrophobic. That question is one that Dunne didn't fully consider at the time, but we'll get more into that later. The final most important casting note, in my opinion, is the onboarding of a one Jenny Agutter.
And then last November, he sent me the script that he'd written, and I was extremely impressed because I thought it was very funny. It was funny also because I knew him, and I recognized all of the characters being in some way partly him, and it was also frightening. And then he said, well, do you want to play the role? I said, terrific. I think one of the things that did attract me, because I had been asked, am I interested in horror films? Well, I am if they're good, but not necessarily as roles, particularly as, women's roles in horror movies tend to be, all you do is exercise your vocal cords. You're running and screaming and hiding in the shadows somewhere. In this, my role is just purely that of the nurse, falling in love with this young, rather engaging American gentleman who thinks he's a werewolf.
I think Miss Jenny had maybe seen more horror movie trailers than horror movies themselves, but that's okay. There is a fair amount of screaming in Halloween, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but at that time there were plenty more movies out there. The point of me showing you this interview clip though is just that I think it's so amazing when a filmmaker's excitement can be contagious. At some point all the stars aligned, right? Okay, now they're shooting in London, but as with literally any production, there were a lot of hiccups. The biggest obstacle they overcame in terms of shooting locations was definitely in Piccadilly Circus, which if you don't know is one of the busiest areas of London. The foot traffic and regular traffic is a nightmare. I actually went there back in 2021, a few little pictures for you, but they had one of the biggest scenes of their movie set in that location, so they had to get real scrappy with it. It's not really like in the States where typically productions will shut down the entire like Hollywood Boulevard, for example. You try to get down to Hollywood for like a weekend activity or something and everything is just closed off. Anyway, that didn't really stop them. They basically engaged in guerrilla filmmaking. They stole the scene away in the middle of the night.
This is a major point in the film. So at the pre-dawn hours one day on the set, on the shooting schedule, with cameras mounted all over Piccadilly Circus, with stuntmen and all these little cars on the 5 avenues that converge on Piccadilly Circus, this giant roundabout, you see this one, all these sounds, crashes, boom, then you're cut, and they all drove away, and it was gone in less than 3 minutes. And if anybody had picked up like, there's a major accident, oh, no, never mind. You know?
Absolutely unreal. I would be actually shitting my pants if I had to stage a car crash in Piccadilly Circus. Filmmakers are built different. They couldn't stage the entire scene on the real road though, so it was rebuilt so they could do some pickups of like insert shots of the crash. And popular fun fact, that is director John Landis getting smashed through a window.
John Landis survives the stunt without a scratch, but he doesn't escape a critical commentary by the members of his crew.
He used to make a living for a little while doing stunt work, so it was just a perfect Hitchcockian cameo with a twist. There are so many other hilarious, fun on-set stories though. I'm just gonna give you the Spark Notes version, otherwise we'd be here all day. When they were shooting out in the countryside for the opening of the film, they lost Griffin Dunne. How did this happen, you might be asking? The crew only had one trailer out on that location, and Dunne went in to use the bathroom, and the truck driver that was hauling the trailer began to tow it away. Imagine being on the can and it starts moving. Nuh-uh. David Naughton also went through some uncomfortable experiences to say the least, particularly while he's at the zoo and his character is running around naked. Another popular fun fact, the woman he ran up to was an extra who was not told that he was going to be naked. Can we take a moment for a consent discussion? Because what? Like I said, they weren't operating totally within the rules. Though back then, I don't even know if there were rules for such a thing with like treatment of extras. I don't know. Speaking of, at one point, David looked up this hill at the zoo and saw just a ton of people milling about and watching them. And he was like, are those extras or something? And someone informed him that no, they were just regular pedestrians enjoying the zoo because it was open. Like I said, they didn't shut things down. Talk about awkward. The scariest moment of shooting, in my opinion, though, is during the cage scene because Naughton really had to be in a cage with some wolves.
They go, okay, we're going to bring in the wolves. And I go, are they? They go, well, they're not tame, but they've been fed. Swear, that was the answer I got.
He went through so much, and they didn't really tell him anything ahead of time. And if it were me, lawsuit, lawyers. And all of that is before we've even gotten into special effects, which we're doing right now. Before we fully get into things, though, we do have to get into a brief history of the career of Rick Baker, who I'm sure that you well know now. He had a long history with John leading up to An American Werewolf in London. The first film they worked on together was called Schlock. John was directing that film at 21 years old, and Rick Baker was doing the effects at 20 years old. It was a very small $30,000 independently funded feature. Rick was brought on when Landis was trying to hire some bigger special effects guys, but realized that he definitely could not afford them. And Rick Baker's operation remained pretty small until An American Werewolf in London came along.
Because Rick, in the last few years, I mean from now going back, had his own building with over 100 employees, 7 Oscars on his, but when I met him, he had rented garage space with a bunch of look like high school graduates who are keen to be apprentices in the makeup.
I just wanted to sort of set the stage for what David and Griffin would be walking into. They were both going through hell long before the shoot even started. David in particular had to get a lot of casting done. Casting is when you have a body part, most often your head, stuck in plaster for ungodly periods of time while it dries. That's so then they can build a mold and have your exact face so they can sculpt off of that for any of the makeup they want to put on you. I highly recommend listening to the audio commentary done by Griffin Dunn and David Naughton because they commiserate on this. And I think that it was David who said, "It occurred to me while my face was smothered that Rick Baker could be psychotic and just pull out my breathing tube at any time." Not a direct quote, but close enough. And wow. I mean, when you put it like that, yeah. Also on the audio commentary and in a lot of other interviews as well, Griffin Dunn talks about the misery of his makeup. This is a very popular fun fact, so I'm sorry if this is redundant for you, but I'm a completionist. It turns out the claustrophobia questions had everything to do with the various stages of makeup that he would be in.
You know, Jack, who was played by Griffin Dunn, his throat is torn out by this wolf, and, half his face is missing, and he continues to degenerate through the course of the film. So I did basically what I thought that would look like, which was this big, hideous, wound in his neck, very scarred up face. And Griffin, on the first day that he did the makeup test, wasn't too pleased about it. He thought no one was really going to look at him because he was so horrifying looking and disgusting.
He was essentially being confronted by his own mortality, and having to imagine himself dead was really upsetting for him. He also suffered what many actors did in the 1980s. He went latex crazy. Again, in the audio commentary, he tells this great miserable story about how the latex felt like bugs crawling on his skin because after 12 hours under the heat of the lights and stuff, it had shrank, it was suffocating him, and that he would never forget the look on Rick Baker's face when he tore it off of himself at the end of the day. I believe that I told almost an identical story about one of the actresses in The Evil Dead during that franchise deep dive. Luckily for him, the last version of Jack we see is a puppet operated by Griffin himself, so he wasn't stuck in loads of makeup that day. But let's get to the real reason why you clicked on this video, the transformation scene.
I remember having arguments with John because I wanted him to be a biped, a two-legged werewolf, because I always think of werewolves more like that, basically probably just because of the Wolfman, Lon Chaney Jr. walking around on two legs. He kept saying he wanted it to be this demon hound from hell.
See, I'm with Rick on this. To me, werewolves are bipedal. That's just a defining characteristic, but whatever. Like John said in the clip earlier, he just didn't think that audiences would buy that anymore, like he felt like it was overdone. There was a lot of transforming to get through before we got to the actual wolf itself, right? Landis wanted to show a transformation that hadn't been done before. He wanted it to be painful and in bright lighting. Landis always thought while watching Lon Chaney Jr. that it just wasn't realistic that he would sit there and just get hairier and hairier. He thought transforming into another creature would be crazy painful. He also wanted to show everything, and so the scene is shot in very bright lighting, and this gave Rick Baker no wiggle room, no horror movie lighting to kind of hide some of the shoddier effects. So first let's start with the hands, which Rick Baker made what are called change-o hands. Basically what you see here, they're hands that can grow and do whatever the script called for. It's puppeteering. The same concept was applied to the head of the wolf. It could grow and retract to reset for the scene. All of that casting and molding and sculpting took Rick Baker months to accomplish, and then it was only on set for a few minutes.
John would say action, and it would go and stretch out, and you go cut, and it's like, okay, we've got that. And it's like, we've got that? I just spent months working on this thing, and you shot, it took you 10 seconds to shoot it. Well, I got it, It's like, well, God, it was like disappointing to think of all that time going into that.
On David's end, of course, he was having no fun at all making this scene. They had individually stamped hairs into, I think Rick Baker said that it was like this sort of rubber paneling thing that would then be stuck on his body, and they shot the hair in reverse. So they used the longest hair first, and then they would pull it through, they would trim it, and then keep going. So David too ended up just being like smothered by all this latex and glue. This whole scene also took 6 days of shooting. In order to keep track of where David was supposed to be in the room, Landis had storyboarded out everything very meticulously, and for a lot of the beats of the scene, David would be stuck in the floor all day. During the audio commentary, he talks about how miserable this was and how he constantly had to reassure himself that it would all be over someday, because apparently for proper continuity, he was not allowed to get up out of the floor. So the crew, while they would take their breaks, because it's a very frustrating shoot, they would turn off the lights and just leave him in the dark. I'm telling you, this comes up in almost every deep dive of your favorite 80s classics. The filmmakers of your favorite horror movies were in the trenches. Psychological warfare was waged on these people, and a lot of it was self-inflicted. self-inflicted, but that's just being a filmmaker. But for the most part, for all the pain and scars caused, we got a lot of really excellent movies out of it. And it's not just for the effects, we learn a lot too from horror history, from both the implicit and explicit themes of a movie. So let's get into that. The most intentional theme of this movie is something that I wouldn't have really guessed, but that would be puberty.
Most horror fans become horror fans at the time of their puberty. And the werewolf is a perfect symbol for puberty.
You know, essentially it's an erection metaphor. Well, a lot of it has to do with adolescence. I remember the whole thing of metamorphosis. You know, when your body is changing, that's what puberty is about. You know, you're getting hairy. I mean, all of a sudden your dick's getting hard. I mean, these weird things are happening to you.
From both Mick Garris and John Landis, that's what the werewolf represents. But I've yet to find an interview where Landis gives a more earnest explanation of what he was going for thematically. He's a really funny, super lighthearted kind of goofball, so I don't really see him getting into the more esoteric conversations like that. Luckily, on the Arrow Video edition of the Blu-ray, there is a video essay written by John Spira, and it's called I Think He's a Jew, The Werewolf's Secret, which I have my Arrow Video edition propped up over there. You cannot see it. So here it is. Isn't she lovely? Isn't she wonderful? Isn't she beautiful? Yes. In the video essay on here, he dives deeply into the subtext of the movie and the Jewish undertones. I think this is really important because I never really got like a puberty vibe from the movie. From Ginger Snaps, oh most definitely. But from An American Werewolf in London, I thought the whole point was just the transformation scene. I struggled to find meaning beyond, well, maybe it's about sort of the rebirth that we go through as young adults, sort of a second puberty, if you will. John Spira takes a really critical angle through a more historical lens, and that helped me out a lot. So please remember that what I'm sharing is not information that I came to on my own. I'm merely pointing out the most interesting elements of his essay. The first thing he pointed out that really shook me was that he was amazed to see a movie with 2 Jewish leads. The only other Jewish representation he got to see were basically concentration camp victims and comedians. He points out that this was still very much a post-World War II era, and Jewish people were not necessarily living very comfortably. He didn't use this term specifically, but it seemed to me like he was getting at how the generational trauma was shaping this newest generation, as represented by the friends in the movie. Something I didn't know that I feel like I should have been taught is how obsessed with wolves Hitler was. And I know this guy also came up very recently in my American Psycho deep dive, and I don't like that, but he's relevant here because of the wolf thing. It's weird. It's a German pagan belief that the wolf represents protection, that it is a protector, that it safeguards travelers' passage through forests and stuff. Hitler took this and ran with it. He called himself a wolf. He referred to his soldiers as wolf packs. His bunker was called the Wolf's Lair. He had a wolf-themed radio show that was like his propaganda channel. But then this weird projection sort of thing started happening where Jewish people were targeted and described as wolves in sheep's clothing, where manhunts started and neighbors started turning on neighbors. Spira felt like with the death of Jack at the beginning of the movie, it set up an arc for David to be dealing with the survivor's guilt that many Jewish people faced, especially when they would get displaced and flee the country. That's another parallel where David is stuck in this country where he feels like he doesn't belong. His dreams also reflect common Jewish fears, like his family being killed while his home is raided. That was a very real lived experience for the generation that preceded him, and this is one of very few depictions of it at the time. At that time, it was a perfectly reasonable fear that was at the back of pretty much every Jewish mind. And even if this wasn't Landis's intention, even if he hasn't really talked about it, it's not like some outlandish theory. The boys both have Jewish surnames, they use Yiddish expressions to insult each other like putz and schmuck. The most interesting moment of the movie thematically that Spira broke down is something he really got stuck on. It's this line right here.
Chart says he's from New York. Oh, I think he's a Jew. What makes you say that? I've had a look.
Again, Spira didn't use this term, but I think that he was breaking this down as a microaggression. Nurse Price, our protagonist, she didn't go, yeah, and so what if he is? She played into it and sought confirmation, which we then learned that the other nurse was very, very creepy, and let's not get into that. To boil down the intention of that scene, it seems like he was getting at the fact that being Jewish was a part of one's identity that they would most likely keep hidden at that time. Because non-Jewish people didn't like people like David. They didn't like the idea of the white Jewish person that was passing and just walking among them and they didn't know it. Very, very, very reminiscent of the whole moral panic around trans people right now. Really good tell when fascism is on the rise. And that's something you internalize. Same thing with internalized misogyny, racism, homophobia, etc. So the other part of Spear's thesis was that that seemed to be what the wolf represented. That David was having to come to terms with how the world saw him and how he saw himself. Essentially coming to terms with his otherness, which a lot of us become disillusioned to at some point in life. I know that as a girl, I started experiencing it probably around like the age of 5 or something, when the kindergarten teacher would be like, all right, can I get a strong boy to help me carry some chairs to the circle or whatever? And even as a kid, I was like, what the fuck? Some pretty deep stuff. I never read that from the movie somehow, and now I'm gonna watch it so much differently. Other popular interpretations include how this is potentially tackling the rise of the fear of mental illness. Ronald Reagan was also a fucking menace, and so he probably had some influence on the themes as well. This is from page 13 of the little booklet that comes with your Arrow Video edition. A fear of the human body was compounded by the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. A Republican and staunch conservative, he was anti-abortion and sought to stigmatize any sexual activity that occurred outside the sanctity of marriage. His regressive rhetoric was aided by a growing moral panic focused on sexually transmitted disease. A widespread fear of infection was such that Time dedicated its front page to a fear-mongering story about herpes, which it described as the new scarlet letter in 1982. Don't you just love how much horror reflects the fears of society at any given time? Ugh! Mwah. What did you glean from the movie? What's your takeaway? I love when things are up to interpretation. I think that always makes for the best movies. While you type about that, I'm gonna talk about the reception of this film. General audiences went nuts. That transformation scene was something that no one had ever seen before.
I took great pleasure in going to see it in theaters because I knew when the big scares were. I wanted it to be as real and horrific as possible. It's extremely unpleasant.
I went with my crew of kids, to Westwood to see the movie when it came out with a real audience. And when that 10 seconds happened of that face stretching out, people stood up and cheered, and it was like, all right, this is why we did that.
What I wouldn't give for a time travel device so I could go back and see the initial reaction to this film. But at the time, like a lot of horror classics, the critics didn't really get it. This review came out shortly after the movie in September of 1981. It was in volume 11 of Cinefantastique, written by Jordan R. Fox. So the basic problem with American Werewolf is that while it can get plenty of comic mileage out of its ill-fated hero for as long as he remains a swearing, incredulous college boy, the subject turns sour whenever the creature goes on the prowl. Like any conventional monster movie, it can't avoid making the monster far more of an attraction than the expendable humans around it. Jenny Aguter's solution is to play the whole thing straight and extremely well too. Her final desperate confrontation with the being she loves is so authentic, with more than a touch of the Lutens about it, as to render the slapstick elements elsewhere almost shamefully vulgar by comparison. The film's other imbalance, and at the same time its most remarkable asset, is the superb special effects work by Rick Baker. I chose this review to read out because it basically sums all of them up. The critics could not fathom a movie that was both funny and scary. I just find it so fascinating. The more that I deep dive into classic horror and the more I learn about the history of film criticism, the dumber that I think critics are. Another thing to consider though is that The Howling had been released just about 5 months prior in April of that year, so it was competing against that. Had they released in the opposite slot and it was the first big werewolf movie of the year, maybe critics would have overlooked some of the comedy in favor of all the amazing filmmaking. Luckily, the Academy did not overlook this film though. This was the first year ever that the Oscars had an award for best makeup.
In recent years, there have been amazing technological advances in the whole field, advances that have tended to blur the distinction between makeup and special effects, which create a whole new reality out of pure illusion. One of the masters of this developing field is a young man named Rick Baker, whose credits include King Kong, and who was nominated this year for his work on An American Werewolf in London.
It was up against only one other movie called Heartbeeps that looked so bad, you guys. Oh my god. It was a comedy about two robots falling in love or something. I'd never heard of it. I think they honestly just needed to come up with something to be up against Rick Baker because he took the prize home, obviously. I also need to clarify that the award was not created because of An American Werewolf in London. A lot of Academy members were up in arms about the year prior when The Elephant Man was not recognized for any of its makeup achievements. So thus the next year they had the category set up, and great timing in my opinion. It also won Best Horror Film and Best Makeup at the Saturn Awards, and there it was also nominated for Best Actress and Best Writing. The movie also did well monetarily. On a budget of under $6 million, it went on to gross over $62 million worldwide. Overall, even if it confused a lot of critics, it was pretty much a sweeping success, and it still continues to be. The lasting impact of this movie really cannot be understated. Critically, things have completely turned around for this movie. It sits at an 89% on Rotten Tomatoes. It has a 7.5 on IMDb, but only a 55% on Metacritic, huh? Like I said at the top of this video though, it's considered by many to be the greatest werewolf movie of all time. We can debate that next week with my Ginger Snaps deep dive, but there's no doubt about it, it's considered an all-time great. There's also no doubt that it inspired Ginger Snaps, Dog Soldiers, Bad Moon, basically any werewolf movie that came after it. It's the blueprint, including for plays as well, that's right. I found a high school play that premiered in November of 2022 in Merced, California. It's called An American Werewolf in London, the Monster Play, and it's as great as it sounds. I thought that there would be absolutely no sense in comparing the makeup, but by golly, they pulled it off. I think the look of Jack starts really strong, and they actually make it evolve throughout the play, and you can see the difference. The transition scene wasn't quite as good though, but what did we expect? They still really do the damn thing, like they do the movie justice. He takes off his shirt, there's great sound effects, he crawls off the stage and then comes back covered in hair. They keep the lighting dim, you know, but it looks pretty good. I honestly could not have expected anything more from a high school production, like bravo. I would buy a ticket to that. You know what I wouldn't buy a ticket to though? A remake. Oop, yeah, so this is a bit of a disappointing note to end on, but there was an official remake announced by, surprise, surprise, Dimension Films. If you know Dimension Films and the Weinsteins and Michael Bay, this really comes as no shock. I'm not gonna get into all of that right now. You can check out like my Scream deep dives. I get into that a little bit there. But basically, all the remakes of the early 2000s kept the lights on at Dimension Films. So when this was announced in 2016, Max Landis, yes, son of John Landis, was attached to write and direct. The younger Landis recently took to his Twitter account to provide a brief update on the film. He began with a self-deprecating take on the writing process, announcing that he had finished his first draft of the script. Finishing my first draft of An American Werewolf in London today took me way longer than usual because every time I opened the final draft file, my laptop would slam closed under the weight of my father's expectations. But y'all, another one bites the dust. In November of 2019, Screen Rant reported that this remake was likely no longer happening. In 2016, Max Landis was said to be on board as writer and director, and he himself confirmed on Twitter that he had completed the first draft of the script in 2017. But that same year, Landis was accused of sexual assault, and more reports about women who suffered emotional and sexual abuse by him have surfaced ever since. In a post-Harvey Weinstein era, and with movements like Me Too and others raising awareness on cases of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, Landis's future projects are on a possibly permanent pause. Yeah, there's always room for another disappointment in Hollywood, isn't there? It's really interesting to me that it seems like people coming out against him were actually successful because his career is pretty kaput right now, because there are so many other abusers that are still just fully employed in Hollywood right now. According to his Wikipedia page though, this sad sack has reverted all the way back to writing, directing, and starring in his own short films, so he's basically on the same level as me right now. It seems like that menace is out of the industry, but what a poor legacy to carry on for his father. So in the spirit of that, I say, okay, I accept. I will pick up the great Landis mantle and I will make the next great werewolf movie. Okay, fine. And I think that I could get Rick Baker at my side. You know why?
And I would actually love to have the opportunity to do a transformation in a film like American Werewolf again. I would definitely take advantage of computer technology as well. I think a real marriage of the techniques, and you could do a transformation that would just totally blow people away. You know, and I hope I get the opportunity in my lifetime to do it again.
What do you say, old buddy, old pal? My business email can always be found in the description box of every single video, so don't be shy. And on that egregiously egocentric note, that brings us to the end of this deep dive today. What did you learn today? What was most shocking? For me, I just felt like a real dunce having never understood the Jewish subtext of the movie, because half my family is Jewish. We celebrate Hanukkah every year, latkes and all. I'm like, girl, I think the next time I watch the movie, that star rating is going up for sure. Let's start a dialogue about whatever you desire down in the comments below. Let's keep this werewolf train rolling rolling. And while you're leaving your comment, I just want to point out that no, I'm not making the next great werewolf movie right now, but I am making my next short horror film. And it's a lot more ambitious than my last one. We're having to shell out quite a bit of money for all the special effects and the makeup, yes, because if you couldn't tell by this video, they're very important to me. So the GoFundMe for that can be linked down below, as well as all my social media, my second channel, anything that your heart desires, go find it. Oh, also my Patreon if you're interested in updates on my short film. You can find those there, as well as other solo reviews for movies that I didn't feel like doing full deep dives of on my channel. But more than anything, I just hope that you enjoyed this video and that I catch you in the next one. Bye!